with I-Corps' webinar series in 2017. The title of today's webinar is Developing Leaders to Lead Resilient Organizations. I'm Linda Nelson, the president of I-Corps, and I will be your speaker today. The topic is one that I'm passionate about, an understanding of organizational resilience and how to increase the resilience of organizations is the cornerstone of I-Corps' mission and vision. Leadership plays a strong role in the development of more resilient organizations. To support I-Corps' mission and vision, I volunteer as an expert member of the ISO Technical Committee 292 and have been part of a work group writing ISO 22316, Organizational Resilience Principles and Attributes. This standard was published in April and it is currently available. This webinar will share a lot of research that has been done about leadership qualities as it pertains to managing an incident or managing a crisis. We use the word crisis a lot in this webinar. And we'll also talk about leadership qualities identified to lead an organization during business as usual times as well. We have several webinar objectives. We want you to gain an understanding of how effective and empowered leaders contribute to a more resilient organization. We want you to learn about specific leadership qualities that should be sought when seeking leaders to build more resilient organizations, and to understand how leaders should lead others when you're building a more resilient organization, and finally to understand the impact of specific behaviors on an organization's resilience. One of the researchers that we're going to be learning about today is a gentleman called Schoenberg, and we'll have the reference for his work at the end of today's webinar. And he says, while planning is important, leadership in a time of crisis, particularly in the aftermath, may trump any preparation. And this might be hard for us to consider as we are, a lot of us attending today's webinar might be focused specifically on the planning aspects, but understanding that leadership and planning don't always match, and what we plan for isn't always what happens. And understanding the elements of leadership in times of a crisis may better help or may better explain more than any other set of crisis plans why organizations survive crises better than others, and to clarify how organizations can endure future crisis events. I always like the quote by Garrison Keillor that his ability to keep cool in a crisis is based entirely on not knowing all of the facts. And I know this is maybe a little bit off topic, but we see this if you have a medical type of emergency. Oftentimes the doctors or other medical personnel will really only tell you what you need to know in order to help you stay calm. And for years, crisis management has been a term synonymous with reactive leadership. And this stems from the belief that a crisis is both unpredictable and unexpected. But we really know this isn't true. A crisis develops as an organization's values, beliefs, culture, and behavior becomes incongruent with its operating environment. It doesn't always have to be a natural disaster. It can be all sorts of different things that can cause an organization to have a crisis. And a leader who is tuned into the signals of an impending crisis and understands how to harness the urgency brought on by this situation can minimize the potential dangers and maximize the resulting opportunities. Hasselbeam has also done some research, and he just really clarifies that crisis management is a test of quality and character of the leadership, as well as it is a test of skill. And you will find that your character will be tested as much as anything else when you're going through a crisis. Flynn says that organizations must change the way they lead in order to be more aware of potential crises as well. So some work done by Wharton and McKinsey states that leadership can actually be found at all levels of the organization, and you know this is true. We're not just talking about top management here. Everybody has the opportunity to be a leader within their own organization. And Wharton and McKinsey emphasize that regardless of their position in the organization, leadership needs to have several key skills, including integrity, strategic thinking, communication, persuasion, and decisiveness. So we're going to be talking about several of these characteristics during the webinar today. There are lots and lots of different quotes when we talk about leadership. Leadership expert John Baldoni points out that authenticity is imperative. When individuals stand up for what they believe and deliver on their promises, their payback is loyalty. Daniel Goleman from the Harvard Business School says that self-awareness, the ability to manage emotions, motivation, empathy, teamwork, persuasion, and being ability to manage relationships is all part of being a leader. John Cotter is also a leader at the Harvard Business School, and he says that the ability to switch between various styles of leadership is very important, as well as the ability to cope with change. And we're going to talk about the importance of having a different leadership style based on who it is that you're leading, as well as what type of incident are you incurring. Mitroff talks about leadership as being the ability to think comprehensively about crises and their consequences. And Yu says that leaders today continuously find themselves vulnerable to crises, and the need for quick decision making, can force individuals to make decisions from the gut rather from the mind. And this really goes back to, again, the planning aspect of being a leader, and to be thinking about how you're going to respond before something happens and to plan for that event. And leadership is also defined as the ability to find meaning in negative events and to learn from even the most trying circumstances. So the focus here is really on the learning aspect of being a leader. So let's take our first poll. Would you consider yourself a leader at your organization? And Tiffany's going to go ahead and run that poll for us.
Linda, looks like we have an audience of leaders with 78% of our audience. 78% of our audience has chimed in, and 100% of them consider leaders.
All right. That's really important to hear. And so take what you're learning today and see what you can implement, in your role at work and within the workplace and the people that you deal with. I also forgot to mention at the beginning of the webinar, if you have questions, you can use the questions. I guess there's like a questions tab or a questions link here, and we will try to answer your questions as we go. And if we aren't able to answer your questions as we go, we will certainly reply to those after the webinar. Alan Schoenberg talks again that he has put together a crisis leadership model that we're going to take a look at today. And it does support the majority viewpoint that there is a difference between people who can lead in a non-crisis situation than those who can lead during an incident or a crisis. And it really is that part of the decisiveness, the ability to make decisions during a crisis that really is the difference between the two types. And the challenge that we all face is that oftentimes we're given leadership responsibilities based on our job title. And so, during regular day-to-day operations, we might be fine with that. But when there's actually an urgency and you need to be making decisions that are maybe outside your comfort zone, that we find the challenges. So when we're looking at crisis leadership outside of the regular leadership, we talk about having the right touch and communicating with people. When people are stressed and they're uncertain and they're afraid, having that right touch becomes very important. A leader also needs to be effective at obtaining followers. I know that I make jokes sometimes in my extended family that we don't have any followers and everybody's leading and going in different directions. Well, somebody needs to be following in order to have effective crisis leadership. As a crisis leader, you need to provide clear direction, and you need to be able to really take over that crisis in order to make people trust that you're managing it in an effective manner. We also need to make sure that we are identifying and empowering crisis leaders that have the capacity for adapting. We're going to be talking about flexibility and adapting and understanding that no matter what the crisis is, it isn't one particular event. It is always a changing situation, and we need to be able to be flexible and adapt to that changing situation. we're going to take a look at 10 characteristics of crisis leaders in a study that was done by Pat Rowe. And one of the first characteristic, if I could say the word, is being able to see things for what they are. Strong leaders live in the front of reality. They recognize events and their significance and do not shy away from the consequences of what they see. They have intellectual integrity. It's part of a key component of their DNA. And they think about what is best for the organization, not for their own personal gain. Also, great crisis leaders have the ability to see the big picture. They can see all the moving parts and understand what is a cause and what is an effect. They get below the 30,000-foot level and can also dig deep into the detail without being mired in it. They quickly develop a detailed knowledge of the issues, and this ability further enhances their capacity to view the problem realistically. They are also willing to consider multiple options once they have identified the problem, and looking at multiple approaches. They might engage others in brainstorming potential solutions without judging those potential solutions, even though they might have a preferred solution in mind. They are confident enough to know and accept that their way may not always be the best way. They are also able to be decisive. Taking ownership of the solution means being decisive. When you feel that you have listened to the best advice, then you're willing to make a decision based on that best advice. Strong leaders will use a combination of real-time data along with their gut, the wisdom built on years of leadership experience. When they make a decision, they know it is. They also need to know that they need to sell it to their key stakeholders in order to get those people engaged. And they don't try to block the effectiveness of the decisions that are being made. It really is important. We're going to talk about getting people to follow you and being able to get people to do what you need them to do. We talked a little bit when you're willing to consider multiple options also means you're willing to collaborate towards a solution. So strong leaders take ownership of the problem, but they understand that the long-term solution is going to require the input and involvement of the many stakeholders, and they identify those individuals and work together towards a solution that is the most supportive and that most can live with. Again, seeking out individuals with different perspectives on an issue. This sounds very similar to willing to consider multiple options and willing to collaborate towards a solution, but it also means listening to people who you might not agree with. And sometimes we surround ourselves with people who think the same way we do. So it's important during a crisis to listen to people who might not agree with you and who might not have the same opinions that you do about a matter. We really need to avoid this one-dimensional thinking. And sometimes we disregard people who don't think like us. And during the crisis, it's really, really important that you consider all different perspectives and you actually seek out those different perspectives. It's also really important for people who are leading to be calm, courageous, and positive. You're going to have a sense of urgency, but you need to remain even-tempered. It's very hard to hold your temper when you're going through a crisis. But we need to be able to recognize both your verbal cues as well as your nonverbal signals that you are staying calm, you're mastering the incident, and you're staying positive about it. You need to be able to deliver bad news when you need to, and do it in a way that avoids panic and provides a realistic level of hope for the future. And you also need to be courageous enough to make decisions that you believe to be the right ones, regardless of whether they might be popular or not. And this kind of ties to our next one, which is taking risk in the face of risk. Crises oftentimes brings the leader face to face with a set of situations they've not previously seen. There are questions which they might not know the answers. Gathering contrarian viewpoints from individuals with whom they might not agree but respect likely means they might create solutions not previously tried and outcomes of which might be unknown. If it is the best solution, however, a strong leader is prepared to take calculated risk. And we see this oftentimes when we run exercises or tests, that people are unwilling to make a decision unless they have enough information. It is really, really important that as a leader, you're going to have to make decisions without all of the information. So understanding that an imperfect decision can oftentimes be better than not making any decision at all, and that your decision can be fine-tuned for implementation later when you had that more information. And lastly, be prepared to admit your mistakes. We are not perfect people during regular times, during business as usual. And during an incident, you're going to make mistakes, and you're just going to be able to have to move on with those mistakes and learn from those and keep moving and making decisions. So let's take a look at our next poll. One of the challenges of the webinar process is we can only put down 5 choices for your responses. So we had to combine those together. So take a look at the next poll and view which ones you think are the most important. You're going to pick your top 2. Well, it looks like we have some very even responses there. You want to go ahead and tell us about them, Tiffany?
Yeah, this is quite interesting. So let's see here. 50% we have able to be decisive and make a decision with limited info. And 46% of our audience sees things for what they are and the ability to see the big picture, which, you know, those two seem to tie in together, as well as 43% remains calm, courageous, positive, and can admit mistakes.
Very good. Thank you for that. There was one question that came up, and yes, our webinars are always available after the webinar, probably by Friday on our website on the webinar page. You can view all the webinars that we have run this year, and they'll be available until the end of the year, and then they'll be part of our members only section. All right, there we go. We're going to talk about leadership values and characteristics. One of the things that a leader needs to have is excellent communication skills and be able to have that emotional or intellectual connection with the people that you're speaking with. And there should be a shared vision between the organization and the stakeholders, and this fosters trust. It's very important for the communicator, for the leader to be able to communicate effectively. And the quality and character of the leader also helps to determine what decisions are made. So making sure that your leadership and who's making these decisions have a quality and character that represents the organization. We talked about adaptive capacity, and this is really important because each crisis is going to require a different response. You have to understand who you're leading, what objectives do you need to accomplish, and how will the actions taken impact the situation and create new consequences. You don't actually want to have an incident that becomes worse because of the actions that you've taken. I'd like to we're going to talk next quite a bit about Alan Schoenberg's leadership model. It's a crisis leadership model. It's a really interesting model, and I think it's something that you can take away and learn from. And like I said, the article will be available after the webinar, and we'll send the article out along with your certificates of attendance. There's been a lot of articles written on leadership, crisis preparation, crisis management, and all of the tactical elements involved in addressing a crisis scenario, but there hasn't been a lot of research, and Alan Schoenberg has done some significant pieces. So what they're looking at are the 4 categories on the outside: your information, your external conscience, your preparation, and your experience. And then you've got your pillars of authenticity and influence that tie to your communications and build your trust. And then the personal attributes and values of the leadership personnel or the specific leader. So we're going to talk about each one of those next. So during a crisis, leaders must have ongoing two-way access to information, whatever that information is, in order to assess the situation and make informed decisions for the benefit of the organization and its stakeholders that will move a situation into a more positive direction. Without information, a crisis leader is really powerless to make effective decisions. The leader also needs external conscience, and what they're talking about here is they need to have someone outside of their organization who can act as a sounding board. And this might be a leader that they respect, a consultant, a mentor, a trusted colleague, but somebody who isn't directly involved in the crisis so that they can have sort of that objective third-party approach. And this neutral advisor is a person who can also be used for two-way communication that can help provide direction, not answers, but really some information to be more subjective in this approach. You also need to be prepared, and here's something that we are very, we know about as professionals in the risk field, that we need to be prepared. So how you're going to deal with the media, understanding and knowing the needs and expectations of your internal and external stakeholders, whether this is in the form of risk management or an outside consultant, whatever it is, you need to be prepared and have some sort of a plan for how you're going to communicate and how you're going to manage different types of incidents or crises. And sometimes your leaders, oftentimes I should say, your leaders are going to need to use the skills acquired in the past from training or from actually having experienced an incident in the past. And here's where we talk about experience. I know that you don't want all of your leaders to be 75 years old because they have lots of experience. But probably a new hire isn't going to be the best person who's, and nothing about young people that's negative here, but if you're 25 years old and newer to the organization, you probably aren't going to have the experience needed to play a strong leadership role for the entire organization. However, you should be able to have a leadership role within the part of the organization where you sit. So, but understanding that experience really is a key piece of becoming a leader, and knowing what's happened in the past and what mistakes you've made in the past and learning from those. Trust allows an organization to function in its normal state of affairs prior to a crisis occurring, and will also be important in sustaining its reputation. We're going to talk about the pillars of authenticity and influence, and how they impact the role of trust. If you're not trusted as a leader, nobody's going to follow you, and people are going to go off in different directions, and you're not going to be able to lead the way you would like to lead. We've talked about the two pillars of authenticity and influence. Authenticity requires a leader to ensure that actions are aligned to the spoken word and that those actions are meaningful, and to ensure that ethics and actions are not at odds at any one time. And you also need to have influence in order to control messages and affect the outcomes of the situation. Again, if people aren't willing to listen to you, if they don't believe you or trust you, and if your messages aren't influencing anyone, it's going to be difficult for this crisis to have a positive outcome. Communications becomes really the foundation of managing the crisis, and the crisis leader is usually, but not always, the internal or external spokesperson of the organization. Now, we've said that leaders should be within the organization and in all parts, and in fact, all of you said that you feel like you're leaders within your organization. But the top leader, during a crisis, somebody needs to be the spokesperson for the organization, and oftentimes that is somebody in top management. And this person must be able to deliver news, updates, and communicate to all the targeted audiences. And the leader must also use two-way communications, which means listening and responding to questions, concerns, and feedback, as well as communications from your internal leadership team as well. The crisis leadership model looks at a variety of personal attributes and values. We talked about a few from the previous study, and Alan Schoenberg's research looks at things in a little bit different way. We see some of these are similar, like being able to be courageous or brave, being able to be adaptable or flexible, being able to be a communicator, this visionary idea. So there are a mixture and combination of qualities that crisis leaders should possess. And while these qualities are potentially endless, this model reflects from this researcher's studies the key traits. So an effective crisis leader will use these attributes to adapt to the needs and expectations from his or her audiences and pull from these qualities. So let's take our next poll. And of these 10 personal attributes of crisis leaders identified by Schoenberg, identify 2 that you believe are the most important. And again, we had to combine them in order for this to make sense.
Okay, the responses are slowly coming in.
It's interesting that at the beginning we had 100% of the people choosing compassionate and relationship building, and now it's moved more towards the being adaptable and flexible.
And it's still shifting, so let's see what we have. So it looks like 64% believes that a crisis leader should be adaptable and flexible. 39, there's that balance there, compassionate and relationship building, and then 36% believe they should be a communicator and charismatic, which I believe those are all definitely some top attributes for a crisis leader as well.
All right. Well, let's take a look. This study actually had a study that they did the same poll, or as you may survey, to people that were part of the Leader to Leader Institute, and they picked the communicator as the number 1. Now they actually had 10 to list from, so they didn't have to bundle them like we did. They had integrity as the second one, being adaptable and flexible as third, being visionary, having courage and bravery. Those were the top 5, so that was really interesting from the Leadership Institute. Then they had relationship building, intelligence, and being able to be analytical, compassionate, and charismatic. So we had adaptable, and then, was it compassionate, Tiffany? And then communication?
We had adaptable and flexible first.
Okay.
Compassionate, relationship building second.
Okay.
Communicator and charismatic third.
All right. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Another study that was done in 2005, and one of the things I want to mention is that I have found some of the best studies on leadership are actually a bit dated. So this tells you that the data on what makes a good leader and what makes a good leader in a crisis has been pretty consistent over time. I just happen to like some of the ones that were a little bit older because of some of the graphics and how they actually reported on their studies. But the information that has been provided from the research has been very consistent over time. So while this one is from 2005, it is a Harvard University study, and I found it very interesting. So they found that there are 7 strategies for leading through a crisis, and we're going to talk about each one of those. Leading from the front, being able to focus on the core purpose, building your team, conducting continuous planning, mitigating your threat, telling your story, and profiting from the crisis. We're going to start with leading from the front. And during periods of crisis, people look for a strong leader. They don't look for committees or to teams. They look for a confident, visibly engaged leader to pull them through. So during a crisis, you need to lead. You need to be visible. You need to be poised. You need to demonstrate courage, show commitment, and maintain perspective. And this is interesting because what you're going to see here from the Harvard University study is a real congruence between the previous two studies, is that what we're asking about leaders, we're asking them to be poised, courageous, to be committed to the organization, to be out in front. So while we might be using a little bit different words, we're seeing that the same sort of attributes are consistent. And this is a very old quote, but he who has why to live for can bear almost any how. This quote really explains the essence of the strategy. And when people understand and pursue their purpose, a purpose that puts meaning into their life, they can weather just about any storm. Viktor Frankl discovered this in a Nazi concentration camp. And as a trained psychologist, he observed that when a person had a greater meaning for living, they lived, or more had the opportunity to live. And those that had lost purpose were more likely to die. And the same thing can be said about an organization. So you need to understand your core purpose. One of the things that we see in different management system standards that deal with managing risk is that no matter what the system, whether it's an information security system or a quality system or a business continuity system, is that the people who are managing that system or managing that risk need to know and understand their core purpose of what it is they're trying to accomplish. And when people know exactly what it is they're trying to accomplish, they are really able to function at a higher level and being able to manage this crisis or incident better. And so successful leaders understand their organization's core purpose. They understand that when you're managing a crisis, you need to rely on the values of the organization and make this the foundation of every action or decision. And making sure that your organization's values, beliefs, and actions remain aligned with its core purpose is also something that's really important. So making sure that during business as usual times that there's an alignment there so that you aren't compromised or vulnerable during a crisis. And so leaders need to make sure they communicate their vision during regular times, but also during a crisis to help reduce anxiety and to ensure long-term organizational stability and security. So make sure that your core purpose is instilled and aligned with reality. Make sure that you provide a vision and that you embody those values, and that you're consistently assessing and updating the purpose of your organization to make sure that this alignment stays in place. So when you're building your team, we talked about the fact that a leader is going to be very important, but when you're doing the planning for a crisis, you're going to need to have a team of people. You cannot be reliant solely on one person during a crisis. So you need to build teams both inside, across, and outside the organization. In Fortune's all-star list of the world's most admired companies, teamwork consistently appears as an important element in the organization's culture. So this should come as no surprise, as it is widely understood that no leader is smart enough to single-handedly deal with all the challenges an organization or community encounters when in crisis. Even well-known crisis leaders like Lee Iacocca, Jack Welch, and Rudy Giuliani credit their success to being surrounded by a great team. So if a leader wants to survive a crisis, he must build teams inside, across, and outside the organization. So I always like this picture of the ants building their own bridge. When you're building your team, you need to make sure that you nurture personal relationships to build a shared identity or bond with every team leader. You need to promote trust and understanding and provide an opportunity, not just provide, but foster an open and forgiving environment. This means that every organization is going to have problems. And when you have an organization that is a culture of identifying risks and identifying vulnerabilities and providing an opportunity for people throughout the organization to share when they've made a mistake, or maybe they've just missed having a big crisis because they were able to identify it and being able to share that with the rest of the organization in a forgiving environment is huge. I can't tell you the number of people I've talked to who have said that they are unable to share near misses at their organization because they will be put at fault for that or criticized for the fact that they weren't prepared for that, even though they missed it by being ready. Or they might have had an incident and they were able to cover it up. And we don't want to be in that type of organization. So when you're a leadership within your own organization and you're providing those leadership qualities, you need to make sure that you're fostering an open and forgiving environment and also providing feedback so that when something does happen, you're giving people the confidence that what they've done is the right way of doing it, or what have we learned from this to be able to not make that same mistake in the future. And it's really that interaction that can help you form that emotional connection that during an actual crisis is going to reap benefits, because you're going to have employee loyalty, support, patience, and cooperation that you're not going to have if you're acting in a manner where people are afraid of you or don't feel comfortable talking to you about what's happened or decisions that have been made. Winston Churchill, I always like his quote when he says, "Let our advanced worrying become advanced thinking and planning." I know that people that are worriers, and instead of worrying about it, let's start planning about it to reduce some of that anxiety. So you need to have continuous planning because we're always having changes. So making sure that you're identifying risks and potential crises, knowing that if we don't have this idea of monitoring, of, I can't remember the word I'm trying to think of right now, but looking forward to things that could impact you in the future versus just being reactionary. Making sure that you have ways for people to report back to you within your organization about what they think might be a potential incident so that you can consider that and plan for that. And of course, we all know that you should have some sort of a plan. We can't always be going by gut instinct. So we need to have some sort of plans for what might happen and also make sure that those plans work. Former President Ronald Reagan said that once convinced that a particular course of action is the correct one, a leader must be undaunted when the going gets tough, and the going will get tough. We also hear that procrastination is the arch enemy of crisis management. Frequently, crises emerge or go from bad to worse simply because someone failed to act. So we need to make sure that we're looking forward to identifying those potential incidents or crises, and then we try to mitigate them as soon as possible so that we're not letting them go and get larger and larger. So leaders must take action, and sometimes tough decisions must be made and made quickly. We're talking again about being decisive. And so crisis mitigation requires immediate triage. You need to stop the bleeding as soon as possible. So again, we talk about taking decisive action. Leaders need to be physically on the scene, meaning that, not if there's a huge flood, they're not expecting you to sit in the floodwaters, or, the natural disasters are sort of easier to say. Of course, you don't want your leaders to be right in the middle of things. But you know what? With all of the hurricanes that we've just experienced in the past month, the people in the United States expect our president to be on the scene in some manner. We expect attention to be given by our emergency managers and by our governors and by our mayors and by our city leaders. We expect people to be there physically as well as present with their actions. And we need those same people to consult with their experts and consult with their teams in order to mitigate that threat. Because like we said before, it can't be dependent just on one person. And I always like Mark Twain's quote, "When in doubt, tell the truth." Effective communication is critical. We've talked about that. And leaders, you have to be communicating through all phases of the crisis, not just at the very beginning. A leader should capitalize on all forms of communication to tell the story in order to ensure the widest reception. So it used to be that you could give a press conference. We all know with social media that that isn't going to be adequate. Yes, a press conference might be called for, but that can't be your only way of communicating. If a leader communicates effectively, he can at least help to frame, if not control, the story. Failing to communicate will result in a misinformed public that may go so far as to damage or destroy the organization. And in the end, how well or how poorly a crisis goes for an organization will have as much to do with its communication as anything else. So make sure your communications are open and truthful, and the leader is seen as genuine. We talked about having a compassionate leader, someone who's trusted. This ties back to telling the truth and being present. So making sure that, again, they're genuine, compassionate, confident, and that if you have that, the leader has already gone a long way towards successfully managing the crisis. And all of those things, again, also build trust. And you need to have trust in your leadership team and the people who are leading throughout the organization. So when you're telling your story, we're talking about rapid. We're saying immediately. And this is all the way back in 2005. So think about how much communication has changed in 12 years. But the fact that even back in 2005, it was very, very important that we communicate quickly. Tell what it is you know as soon as you know it, and come back with more, and tell them you'll come back with more information as you have it. It needs to be honest, transparent, and by doing this, you're going to limit your long-term media scrutiny. When the media is out there, they want a story. If you give them something, they will go with that story. If you don't give them anything, they're going to keep digging and perhaps tell a story that isn't the one that you want told. When you have a spokesperson, it should be an identifiable leader, someone who is recognized and who is seen to be the correct person to talk for your organization. And we're going back again to that your message should remain grounded in the organization's core purpose and values. So you're seeing a lot of repetitive things here, which again I believe is really encouraging because it's consistent messaging from different organizations who have done research on this, telling us very similar things. You also need to profit from the crisis. And Winston Churchill again says that the pessimist sees difficulty in every opportunity, and the optimist sees opportunity in every difficulty. Time is not a leader's friend. And we talk about the longer a crisis drags on, the more likely it is that the organization will be associated with trouble and conflict in the public's mind. Similarly, while an organization is embroiled in a crisis, it is likely that it's not working on its normal stuff. You're not operating at peak efficiency. So employees will become increasingly concerned with the health of the company, and you're going to start to see defections increasing and people not engaged in their regular work. Relationships the leader has developed with suppliers, customers, investors, stakeholders, which strengthened in the early stage of a crisis, will become increasingly strained the longer it goes on. The leader must press on to the next move and must resolve the crisis. So at some point, the crisis is going to end, and the leader should declare the crisis being over. And this declaration really serves as a stand down to the crisis team, turn off the crisis mindset, and focus on adapting the organization while searching for opportunities. So to give closure, the leader should meet with the organization. He should explain that about what happened, why it happened, and he should also describe how things have been resolved and where they stand currently or today. And finally, he should reiterate the company's core purpose and values and ask everyone to do his or her best moving forward. So as soon as the danger is averted, the leader, by saying that the crisis is over, really helps people to start learning from it and getting the organization back on target. The temptation, however, is to return the organization to the status quo. So you need to take advantage of the urgency and attention to address the underlying issues that caused the crisis in the first place. Organizations that have been part of an audit to a management system, for example, you have nonconformities, and one of the first things that they ask you to do is to identify the cause of the nonconformity. So here again, we want to be looking at what's the cause of the crisis. so that you don't find yourself right back into it again with a similar problem. So to summarize, you should move forward to end the crisis as quickly as possible. You should learn from the crisis and take advantage of the situation to address underlying issues that caused it in the first place. So adapt. Our next quote says, "But as to the exercise of the mind, a prince should read histories and consider in them the actions of excellent men. You should see how they conducted themselves in wars, should examine the courses of their victories and losses so as to be able to avoid the latter, of course, the victories, or I'm sorry, imitate the latter." I'm really confused here. Avoid the latter and imitate the former. So you want to make sure that you have more victories than you have losses. So let's go to do our next poll and look at which of the strategies for leading during a crisis do you feel is the strongest strategy at your organization? Again, there was only 5 options, so we had to combine a couple of them.
This is pretty split here. Outside of the first one is continuous planning and mitigating threats. At 30% of our audience, we have a 3-way tie of 19% of the leaders who lead from the front, a focus on core purpose and strong teams. And in last place is learn from the crisis and share the story.
That is really interesting. So this really shows that each of our organizations is different, and that we focus as organizations on our crisis management aspects of this really differently. And so when you say that, that you've got really strong teams, for example, now you've got some things to look at for the future of your organization to say, okay, we need to really making sure that we're focusing on our core purpose, or that we're learning from the crisis and that we're sharing our story afterwards. So this gives you some information as well when you're looking at what's strong in your organization, to also consider where are you weak and where can you make improvements. So we need to start evaluating our leaders and evaluating our leadership style. Consider how persuasive is your leadership. Is there a demonstrably strong level of commitment among your people throughout the organization? Do you think you have like employee relations equity? Are people willing to follow you? And what kind of steps can you take to increase the probability of people being willing to do exceptional things in a crisis? So making sure, if your leadership is not persuasive, if you don't have people following you, if your culture of your organization is not real healthy, it's going to be very hard during a crisis to be able to draw on that culture in a positive manner. What kinds of history do you have with your leadership? Are they consistent and candid in an accurate and timely manner? Are they respectful and trustworthy? So the effectiveness of leadership in a crisis is shaped by those patterns of leadership today. So understanding that it is really, really important how you lead as leaders on a daily basis, so that when you do have a crisis, you can draw upon that leadership equity that you've built. So some leadership strategies for you to consider. Encourage autonomous decision-making within focused business cells. And this might sound a little strange, but this really means is that you can't micromanage. You have to empower leaders throughout your organization, and for people that report to you, allow them to make decisions within their area of expertise. Now that's what they mean by that focused business cells. You know, there's going to be problems that arise day to day, and if everybody has to look to one person to make decisions, you're going to find that you're really in a bottleneck and you're not able to move forward. Because of that, managers and staff must be allowed to fix serious problems without constraints placed on them by senior or top management. When you have a constant referral of decisions up the chain of command or unnecessary review of lower level decision making, this could really prove to be risky during a crisis. So consider limits and responsibilities and how to send decisions back to staff for local resolution. So really that balance. You don't want people to be making decisions outside of their realm of expertise and their realm of responsibility. But you also have to allow them to do that, and you have to trust that they'll do that. And so that's where we get back to the planning and the exercising and the testing for that. So how can we strengthen leaders? In the ISO 22316 standard on organizational resilience, they talk quite a bit about leadership and culture, and they talk about how you can strengthen leaders to help implement your organizational resilience strategy. And the first thing is that leaders are intentionally sought. So I want to go with that first piece because this is a long sentence. Leaders are intentionally sought. When you are hiring and you're working with HR, what kind of people are you looking to hire? I know that more and more when you're looking to change jobs or you're looking to be hired, you're having to go through more and more testing by HR. And so look at your organization and ask those questions. Are leaders intentionally sought throughout the organization? Is that something we do, or we just hope we get a leader when we hire someone? Do you have leaders who will act with integrity? How do you measure that? How do you evaluate that beforehand? Do you have leaders that can adapt to changing circumstances? Here again, I know that there are tests and exercises that go through with hiring practices to find out how adaptable people are. Are they able to make decisions under a stressful time? Are they able to move from one thing to another? And then when you're looking to hire leaders throughout your organization, make sure you have a diverse set of skills. You do not want to have that groupthink. You want to have people who are diverse and who can look at things from multiple viewpoints to help you make decisions. They should have experience as leaders, they should have knowledge on how to lead, and they should be having behaviors that you're seeking. You want to be looking that, do we provide strategic direction as part of our decision making? That's a question to ask. So how do we provide direction to people on a day-to-day basis in making decisions? Do we seek and promote innovative ideas? You can't expect people to trust you enough to be innovative during a crisis if they're not allowed to be innovative during day-to-day operations. So making sure that if you want to strengthen your leaders, that you also strengthen the opportunity for people to be innovative. Making sure that lessons learned are shared to promote better practices. I think we all would agree that that's something that we're well aware that needs to be done. Whether we have the power to do it through the entire organization is a different question, but you can do it with the people that report to you and that are part of the leaders in your or part of the people that you lead. Making sure that your leaders are effective and empowered. They need to be, we talked about being trusted and respected, and that leadership is distributed throughout the organization. So you're hearing some reoccurring themes here. And that leaders are provide a culture, again, where innovation and creativity is encouraged, and that you have leaders that people want to follow. It's great to have leaders, but people need to be able to follow those leaders. So they have to be charismatic and they have to be trusted. So to summarize, leaders are located at all levels of the organization. They need to be identified and developed during business as usual and not during a crisis. The situation often determines the leader, remembering that there is no one-size-fits-all crisis, and so sometimes you're going to see different people called out to be leaders depending on what kind of incident it is. And we all know that changing situations are going to require leaders to use adaptive capacity in order to modify communication styles, organizational goals, and the approach in handling new information. Leaders must take the time to determine who they are leading, the objectives they seek to accomplish, and how every action they take will impact the situation and create new consequences. These are the references that we have used in this study. The U.S. Department of Defense study was actually completed by Harvard University, so we referenced Harvard University in those. And we can provide these references to you along with your attendance certificate. If you're interested in learning more about this, I-Corps has a professional development program that is a e-learning course. It's a series of 8 modules under the title Crisis Management and Communications Professional. It does include a certification exam that you can challenge with or without taking the course. This is a professional certification for crisis management and communication professionals. Or if you just want to learn a little bit more about this topic, we have an e-learning workshop that's equivalent to about 90 minutes, about an hour, hour and a half to 2 hours. It has a lot more of the references, a lot more readings that you can also study along with that. And that's part of our human resource discipline, Developing Leaders of Resilient Organizations, the same title of this webinar. Our next webinar will be on October 25th about preserving, protecting, and recovering data. It'll be very technology focused. In November 29th, it'll be about information security. And December 13th, we'll be talking about your supply chain, looking at your security, your continuity, and managing the risk in your supply chain. We thank you for attending today. And Tiffany, were there any questions that needed to be answered? We have about 3 minutes left.
Yes, you have one question about exercises during hiring practices for leadership. Can you share some of those, or offline, or for interviewing purposes? And they're asking for recommended answers for a business continuity manager.
Yeah, that's interesting. So my suggestion would be first to go to your HR people and find out what sorts of hiring practices they have, and to understand what types of tests that they're giving. Maybe they're not giving any. I recently talked to a woman who literally had a full week of testing. On site, she had to go to the organization that she wasn't even hired for. She was just applying for the job. And in order to get to the finals, she had to go through an entire week of testing, and each day, or it had a different kind of topic to it. So they were looking for people, if you're speaking specifically about business continuity, it depends about the job description for this business continuity manager. A business continuity manager at one organization might look completely different than at a different organization. So does this person need to help manage incidents, or are they only on the planning side of it? That's going to be a different set of qualifications and needing different leadership styles. Is the person going to be responsible for running training and for leading teams? If so, you're looking for different skill sets than for somebody whose primary responsibility is to maybe collect business impact analysis data, do your risk assessments, make sure plans are updated. Then someone who also has to run exercises is going to have to be more of a leader. So that would be the question I would ask, is what are the actual requirements of the job, and then what sorts of skill sets does that require on the leadership side, and then get to HR and talk about how are they testing people to see if they actually have these capabilities, or is it based on their resume? What kinds of questions are being asked at the interviews about their experience? Because remember, experience is also part of this. What kinds of incidents or what kinds of crises have you experienced, and what was your role in that in the past? So even getting it as part of your interview process, so the people that are doing the interviewing, to make sure that they're asking those sorts of questions. That's a really good question. I can't go out and just say that your organization should use this sort of test or this sort of, a different test, just because we can't endorse things or actually say anything negative about any other ones. But Google is a great search tool, and you could probably get a lot of information there, but I think your HR people are probably the most knowledgeable in that aspect. Any other questions, Tiffany?
Yes, Linda, you had one more. Actually, there's two. Let's answer the first one. This is once again about how to view this presentation. Again, I know you'll have it on the website, but will you be sharing the actual slides on the website as well, or is it just a recording?
It is just the recording. We don't give out the slide decks per se, but you'll be able to view the recording and view the slides. And like I said, the references will be emailing out with the presentation so you can read the full documents.
Okay. And the next question, last question, is what competency program can you recommend to develop leaders for crisis situations?
Well, I don't really have any I can recommend right now.
Okay. Wasn't sure if that was I-Core competency programs, but I just wanted, that was the last question.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. This webinar will be available probably by Friday, and we strongly encourage you to please fill out the evaluation that will come to your email after the webinar closes so that we can help to make improvements as well. Thank you very much for attending.